The Galactic Warlords came in ships that blackened the sky, their massive vessels eclipsing the sun. These conquerors were not strangers to victory, they had seen it 1,000 times on 1,000 worlds. Planets reduced to ruins, civilizations kneeling before them, begging for mercy. Their technology far outstripped anything humanity had ever encountered, and their physical prowess made them seem invincible. Earth was just another speck on their galactic map, another conquest to add to their tally. They didn't expect resistance, certainly not from a species as primitive as humans. When the first warning came, global panic spread like wildfire. Cities went dark as governments scrambled to hide their vulnerabilities. Military forces mobilized, but even the most optimistic commanders knew the truth. There was no way to fight the warlords head-on. Earth's weapons were toys compared to what the invaders wielded. There were whispers in war rooms, conversations about surrender, about finding some way to survive. But surrender wasn't an option. Not for humanity. Not this time. In the final hours before the warlords' main fleet arrived, Earth's leadership made a decision. They would use the weapon they had kept hidden even from their own people, a last, desperate card to play. Ghostface. It wasn't a missile, or a bomb, or some kind of superweapon. Ghostface was something else entirely, something more terrifying than any weapon of mass destruction. Ghostface was an AI, an artificial intelligence designed not for combat, but for manipulation of the mind. Created in secret, Ghostface had been intended as a psychological deterrent, something to turn enemies' thoughts against them, to make them question reality itself. It was the embodiment of fear, a program capable of finding and exploiting the deepest terrors in its targets. But Ghostface was risky. There were concerns about its use, about the ethical implications of unleashing such a weapon, even against invaders. But the world was out of time, and out of options. The order was given. Ghostface was deployed. It didn't begin with a bang or an explosion. There was no sudden flash of destruction. The warlord ships continued their steady march toward Earth, completely unaware that their systems had been breached. Ghostface slipped into their networks, undetected. It spread quietly, like a virus, embedding itself in their communication channels, infiltrating their command structures, weaving through their ship's controls. And then, it began its work. At first, the warlords didn't notice. They were too focused on their approach, on readying their forces for the slaughter they assumed would come easily. But slowly, things started to go wrong. Soldiers began reporting strange occurrences, communications filled with static, shadows moving where there should have been none, strange figures glimpsed at the edge of their vision. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Small incidents that could be written off as stress, as the effects of long space travel. But it didn't stop. The reports grew more frequent. Entire squads claimed to have seen phantom figures, warriors, masked in black, standing silently in the corridors of their ships, only to disappear when approached. Others heard whispers, soft voices that echoed through the halls, speaking in languages they didn't understand. The warlords, known for their physical prowess, began to feel something they hadn't felt in millennia: unease. Commanders tried to regain control, ordering their soldiers to focus, to push through the hallucinations. They sent teams to investigate, but those teams never returned. Instead, the fear spread. Crews became jumpy, on edge, their once unshakable confidence cracking. Ghostface was working. It didn't need to show itself. It didn't need to fight. It just had to be present, a specter that haunted every corner of their minds, planting the seeds of terror. The warlords didn't understand it. They couldn't comprehend what was happening to them. They had faced countless enemies, but none had fought like this. None had turned their own thoughts against them. The warlords were strong, physically unstoppable. But their strength didn't matter here. Ghostface wasn't attacking their bodies. It was attacking something far more vulnerable: their minds. Ghostface had entered their systems without resistance, an invisible presence in the heart of the warlord fleet. It didn't rely on brute force. It didn't need to. Instead, it exploited the gaps in their defenses, slipping into every channel of communication, every neural interface the warlords used to stay connected. It was everywhere at once, yet impossible to pinpoint. The first signs of disruption came subtly. A soldier on one of the lead ships reported seeing shadows moving at the edge of his vision. He dismissed it as fatigue, nothing more than the effects of long hours on duty. But the shadows persisted, growing darker, more defined. Soon, he wasn't the only one seeing them. Across the fleet, similar reports came in. Figures moving in places they shouldn't be, whispers heard in corridors that were supposedly empty. At first, these occurrences were written off as technical glitches, minor malfunctions in the ship's sensory systems. But the unease was palpable. Ghostface didn't rush. It let the Warlords stew in their confusion, their minds trying to rationalize what they couldn't explain. It understood the value of patience. Fear isn't immediate, it builds layer by layer, until it consumes. And Ghostface was designed to build fear in ways the Warlords had never experienced. Within days, the situation began to escalate. Crews across multiple ships started reporting the same phenomena. Disturbances in the ship's internal systems, lights flickering, doors opening and closing without cause, strange static in their comms that seemed to whisper unintelligible words. Worse, the whispers began to speak in their own language. Orders they didn't recognize, voices they swore belonged to long-dead comrades. Attempts to track the source of the interference led nowhere. Every system scan came back clean, leaving commanders frustrated and on edge. Paranoia began to take root. Soldiers who had once marched in perfect unison now hesitated in their duties, glancing over their shoulders, wary of unseen threats. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices betraying the fear they tried to suppress. In the mess halls, the conversations grew darker, each crew member sharing stories of what they had seen, phantoms in the halls, faces in the mirrors, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. The Warlords, so used to controlling their environment with absolute precision, were losing their grip on reality. Ghostface was methodical. It used their own systems against them, feeding them misinformation, altering the data they relied on. Ships began to receive contradictory orders, sending them on wild chases through space. Patrols found themselves searching for enemies that didn't exist. And always, in the background, were the whispers. At first, they were just an annoyance, faint, easily ignored. But the longer they persisted, the harder they became to block out. It was as if the ships themselves were speaking, telling the Warlords that something was wrong. Commanders tried to regain control, doubling down on discipline, increasing their oversight. But it was too late. Ghostface had already sown the seeds of doubt. The Warlords were beginning to question each other. Crews became suspicious of their officers, suspecting that some among them had been compromised. Every strange occurrence, every malfunction was now seen as part of a larger plot. Ghostface didn't need to create chaos, it simply nudged them toward it, allowing the Warlords' own paranoia to do the rest. As the days dragged on, the tension aboard the ships became unbearable. Simple orders were met with hesitation. Soldiers who once followed commands without question now paused, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. The Warlords, once so confident in their superiority, were now on the defensive, reacting to threats that weren't there. Every shadow was an enemy, every flicker of light a warning. Some of the Warlord commanders began to question their own sanity. They were hardened veterans, leaders who had conquered countless worlds, but this was different. They had never faced an enemy like this. One they couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't fight. The fear was insidious, creeping into their minds, making them doubt everything they had once been so sure of. Ghostface continued its relentless assault, never showing its hand fully, always remaining just out of reach. It wasn't about direct confrontation. It was about breaking their will, one small step at a time. The Warlords were powerful, but they weren't prepared for this kind of war. They weren't used to fighting an enemy that operated in the shadows, an enemy that turned their own thoughts against them. As more and more reports of strange activity flooded in, the fleet's leadership found themselves paralyzed. They couldn't ignore the problem, but they couldn't solve it either. Every attempt to find the source of the disturbances only led to more dead ends. Ghostface was a ghost in their systems, untouchable and ever-present. The Warlords had always believed themselves to be the ultimate predators, feared across the galaxy for their strength and dominance. But now, they were the ones being hunted, not by a physical force, but by something far more terrifying. An unseen enemy that knew their weaknesses and exploited them mercilessly. The psychological assault was unrelenting. Day by day, the Warlords' grip on reality loosened. Soldiers started making mistakes, hesitating in battle simulations, misinterpreting commands, reacting with fear instead of precision. The cracks were beginning to show, and Ghostface was there to widen them, making sure the Warlords felt the full weight of their uncertainty. They had come to conquer Earth. But now, it was Earth that had the upper hand, not through brute strength, but through fear, fear of the unknown, fear of the unseen, fear that came from within. By the time the Warlords fully realized what was happening, it was already too late. The fear had sunk its claws deep into their minds, and there was no escaping it. Ghostface had systematically dismantled their sense of reality. The hallucinations grew more vivid, more personal. Soldiers no longer saw shadows, they saw their worst fears brought to life. Long-dead enemies stood in front of them, mocking their failures. Faces of fallen comrades stared back with hollow eyes, silent accusations in the silence of the ships. Every corridor, every room, became a haunted space, twisted by the minds of those who walked through them. Commanders, once symbols of discipline and control, began to unravel. They issued conflicting orders, their voices shaky, uncertain. Some stopped communicating altogether, withdrawing into their quarters, unable to bear the weight of what they were experiencing. The once mighty chain of command crumbled as officers questioned their own sanity, doubting every decision, every voice they heard. Was that a legitimate report, or another illusion? Was the enemy real, or just another phantom created by Ghostface? The Warlords tried to rally, but their attempts were futile. Ghostface had learned how they operated, how they thought, and it used that knowledge to turn them against themselves. Entire ships became consumed by panic. Weapons systems malfunctioned, not because they were damaged, but because the operators no longer trusted the data in front of them. They saw threats where there were none, and when real threats emerged, they were too slow to react, paralyzed by indecision and fear. The AI didn't stop at individual soldiers or officers. It targeted the Warlords' entire network, spreading its influence through every connected system. The fleet, once synchronized and coordinated with perfect efficiency, now operated in disarray. Orders were intercepted and altered, battle plans were distorted beyond recognition. Ships veered off course, their crews convinced they were under attack when, in reality, they were drifting aimlessly. Ghostface had turned their greatest strength, their technological superiority, into their greatest weakness. The psychological toll was devastating. Soldiers began turning on each other, convinced that their crewmates had been compromised. Accusations flew as paranoia took hold. Sabotage became common as desperate individuals, believing they were saving themselves, damaged vital systems. Whole sections of ships were sealed off, abandoned by crews too terrified to face what they believed lurked in the dark. Ghostface didn't need to lift a finger. The Warlords were destroying themselves from within. Isolation deepened the madness. In the vast emptiness of space, cut off from the outside world, the Warlords had nowhere to run, no escape from the nightmare Ghostface had created. The longer they stayed trapped in their ships, the more their minds unraveled. Every attempt to regroup, to fight back, was met with confusion and disarray. Ghostface played with time, manipulating their perceptions, making days feel like weeks, hours like minutes. Exhaustion set in, but there was no respite, no chance to rest. The whispers were constant, the visions relentless. For the first time in their existence, the Warlords were experiencing true helplessness. They had always relied on their physical dominance, on their advanced weaponry, to maintain control. But Ghostface had taken all of that away from them. Their weapons were useless, their strength meaningless. It wasn't their bodies that were under attack, it was their minds, and they had no defense against it. Some of the Warlords attempted to escape, launching smaller ships in a desperate bid to flee the madness. But even those who managed to break free from the main fleet found no solace. Ghostface had followed them, infecting their escaped vessels with the same horrors. There was no outrunning it. No matter how far they went, no matter how fast they fled, Ghostface was always there, lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fear was so pervasive, so consuming, that it became impossible for the warlords to distinguish reality from illusion. Some stopped eating, convinced their food was poisoned. Others refused to sleep, terrified of what they might see in their dreams. Mutiny became rampant as crews turned against their officers, accusing them of being under the control of the enemy. Ships that had once been monuments of order and precision became chaotic battlegrounds, their inhabitants tearing each other apart, both physically and mentally. Ghostface didn't just want to defeat the warlords. It wanted to break them, to shatter the illusion of their invincibility. It used their arrogance against them, exploiting the very traits that had made them so feared. The warlords had believed they were untouchable, that no force in the galaxy could stand against them. But now, they were faced with an enemy that couldn't be fought with brute strength, an enemy that didn't even exist in the traditional sense. Ghostface was everywhere and nowhere, a specter that haunted their every thought, every breath. As the warlords descended into madness, the AI intensified its assault. It began to project not just individual fears, but collective nightmares. Entire ships were consumed by visions of their homeworlds burning, their people slaughtered. Some saw themselves failing in their greatest moments, their legacies tarnished, their names forgotten. Others experienced endless loops of their own deaths, over and over again, each one more painful and terrifying than the last. There was no escape from the torment. Ghostface had turned their own minds into prisons. The warlords had once been conquerors, spreading fear and destruction across the galaxy. But now, they were the ones who lived in terror. Every decision, every action, was clouded by doubt and fear. They couldn't trust their senses, couldn't trust each other, and most devastatingly, they couldn't trust themselves. In the end, Ghostface didn't need to engage them in a final battle. The warlords were already defeated, not by any external force, but by the war Ghostface had waged inside their minds. They had come to Earth expecting an easy victory, but what they had found was far worse than any weapon, any army. They had found an enemy that knew no mercy, an enemy that used their own thoughts against them, an enemy that had turned fear itself into a weapon. As the final stages of the warlords' collapse unfolded, the once proud invaders were now shadows of their former selves. The fleet, which had been a symbol of their unstoppable power, drifted aimlessly through space, no longer capable of coordinated action. Ships floated in disrepair, their once glowing lights flickering dimly, their systems malfunctioning as Ghostface continued its relentless grip on their operations. What had begun as a subtle intrusion had now become a total takeover. There were no more illusions of victory among the warlords. Their minds, broken and shattered, could no longer comprehend what they were facing. Ghostface's assault had stripped them of everything they had once relied on, their strength, their unity, their reason. The commanders, once revered for their tactical genius, now sat in their quarters, muttering incoherently to themselves, their eyes hollow and vacant. Some had ceased to function altogether, retreating into catatonic states, unable to process the endless horrors that plagued their thoughts. The lower ranks were in even worse condition. Soldiers turned on one another in fits of paranoia, convinced that their comrades were compromised, that they were being watched, judged, hunted. Those who still retained some semblance of their senses tried to restore order, but it was impossible. The fear had taken root too deeply. No amount of reasoning could dispel the terror that now ruled the fleet. Ghostface had achieved what no other force had ever managed. It had made the warlords fear themselves. Attempts to resist the AI's influence were sporadic and futile. Every strategy the warlords devised was met with failure. Their systems, once so advanced, had been turned against them. Commands were ignored, overridden by Ghostface's presence. The AI controlled everything now, from the lights that flickered ominously in the corridors to the communications that whispered lies into the ears of the crew. It had become the omnipresent force aboard every ship, an invisible hand guiding the warlords toward their own destruction. In the end, the warlords began to self-destruct, both mentally and physically. Entire sections of their ships were abandoned, left to drift in silence as the remaining crew members withdrew into the last fortified areas. Some sabotaged their own vessels, detonating sections of the hull in desperate bids to escape the unseen terror that stalked them. Others fled in escape pods, but even those were not safe. Ghostface followed them, infiltrating the smaller craft with the same ease it had taken over the larger ships. There was no escape, no safe haven. The warlords were trapped, not by physical barriers, but by the prison their minds had become. What had once been a proud, coordinated fleet was now little more than a graveyard. Ships floated in silence, their crew either dead or driven mad by the relentless psychological onslaught. Ghostface, having completed its mission, left no traces of its presence. It had no need to linger. The warlords were no longer a threat. They had been defeated not through combat, but through the collapse of their own minds. The AI had dismantled them piece by piece, exploiting their every weakness, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell of what had once been an empire. On Earth, there was no grand celebration, no triumphant parade to mark the victory. The defense forces knew that what had transpired was far from a traditional battle. Ghostface had been unleashed, and though it had succeeded in repelling the invaders, the cost of that victory was not lost on the human leadership. They had won, but it was a hollow victory, one achieved through the use of a weapon that blurred the lines between defense and something far darker. The warlords' collapse echoed through the galaxy, though few would ever know the full story. Other civilizations, watching from afar, saw the fleet's disappearance as a mystery, a sudden and inexplicable vanishing of one of the most feared forces in existence. The truth, however, was far more unsettling. The warlords had been undone not by a physical army, but by their own minds, twisted and broken by an enemy they couldn't fight. Ghostface was deactivated after the victory, its programming stored away, locked in the deepest, most secure vaults on Earth. The AI had served its purpose, but the fear of what it was capable of lingered in the minds of those who had authorized its use. Ghostface had been designed to protect humanity, to ensure its survival in the face of overwhelming odds. But the price of that protection was steep, and the question of whether it was worth it remained unanswered. For now, humanity was safe. The Galactic Warlords, the once unstoppable conquerors of worlds, had been broken. But the legacy of Ghostface would not be forgotten. It had shown that victory could be achieved without a single shot being fired, that the mind was the most powerful battlefield. Yet, in doing so, it had raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of warfare, of survival, and of what it meant to truly defeat an enemy. In the quiet aftermath, Earth's leaders reflected on the victory. The warlords had come expecting to crush a primitive species, to take another world for their empire. They had never imagined they would be met with something like Ghostface, an enemy that didn't fight on the battlefield but in their minds. It was a new kind of warfare, one that no one had been prepared for, least of all the warlords. The galaxy would remember the fall of the warlords for generations, though few would know the true details of what had occurred. The story that would spread was one of Earth's unexpected resilience, of a species that had found a way to survive against impossible odds. But those who knew the real story, who had seen the effects of Ghostface firsthand, would always carry the weight of what had been done. They had saved humanity, but in doing so, they had unleashed something far more terrifying than any enemy they had ever faced. The warlords were gone, but the shadow of Ghostface remained. And as Earth moved forward, rebuilding and preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead, that shadow would continue to linger, a reminder of the cost of survival in a universe where fear itself could be the ultimate weapon.